Dr. Hana Kim wiped the sweat from her forehead as she stared at the readings on her scanner. Something was very wrong with the alien ambassador, and everyone else seemed too busy or too scared to notice. The diplomatic meeting had been going on for 3 hours now, and the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The Velthari ambassador, Thexara, stood nearly 8 feet tall with silver scales that normally shimmered like liquid mercury. But today, those beautiful scales looked dull and lifeless, like old pennies left in the rain. Hana had studied alien psychology for 6 years, and she knew the signs of extreme stress when she saw them. "Lieutenant Park," she whispered to her partner, who was busy monitoring communication frequencies. "Look at the ambassador's scale patterns. They're completely erratic." June Park barely glanced up from his equipment. "All aliens look weird to me, Doc. That's why they pay you the big bucks to figure them out." He chuckled at his own joke, but Hana wasn't laughing. She watched as Thexara's voice, usually melodic and soothing like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, became harsh and grating. The other human diplomats winced every time the ambassador spoke, but they attributed it to typical alien weirdness. They had no idea they were watching a mental breakdown in real time. The Velthari were known throughout the galaxy as the most emotionally stable species anyone had ever encountered. They were like the wise old monks of space, always calm, always in control. Seeing one in distress was like watching a mountain suddenly start shaking. It just didn't happen. Captain Lee Sung sat at the head of the negotiation table, his jaw set, in determination as he listened to the trade proposals. The humans needed advanced energy technology, and the Velthari had it. But negotiations weren't going smoothly. Every time the humans made a counteroffer, Thexara's scales would flicker more violently. Hana pulled up her personal files on Velthari physiology. Their scales weren't just for protection like she'd initially thought. They were emotional regulators, kind of like how humans sweat when they're nervous, but way more complex. The patterns and colors reflected their mental state, and right now, Thexara's patterns looked like a storm was raging inside their mind. "This is bad," Hana muttered to herself. Really bad. She'd read reports about Velthari mental breakdowns before, though they were incredibly rare. When it happened, it wasn't just bad for the individual. Their telepathic abilities could create feedback loops that affected everyone around them. In extreme cases, it could cause permanent brain damage to nearby beings. The meeting dragged on, with human negotiators pushing harder for better terms, while Thexara's condition visibly worsened. The ambassador's hands started trembling, and their scales began making a soft crackling sound, like ice breaking on a frozen lake. Hana couldn't take it anymore. She stood up from her observation post, ignoring the confused looks from her colleagues. Protocol said she should stay in her designated area and only speak when spoken to, but protocol didn't account for what she was witnessing. "Ambassador Thexara," she called out softly, her voice cutting through the heated discussion about trade percentages and shipping routes. The entire room fell silent. Captain Lee shot her a look that could have melted steel, but Hana ignored him. She walked slowly toward the ambassador, her hands visible and empty in what she hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "You look tired," she said simply, pulling out a small thermos from her bag. "Would you like some tea? It's chamomile. Humans drink it when we need to relax." Thexara stared at her with large dark eyes that seemed to hold the depth of ancient oceans. For a moment, nobody moved. The other diplomats looked back and forth between Hana and the ambassador like they were watching a tennis match. "I do not understand," Thexara said, their voice slightly less harsh than before. "You offer me sustenance? I offer you kindness," Hana replied, unscrewing the cap of her thermos. The gentle scent of chamomile filled the air. "Sometimes that's more important than any trade agreement." She poured the warm tea into the cap, which doubled as a small cup, and held it out. "There's a quiet observation lounge down the hall. Maybe we could sit for a few minutes, just to breathe." Captain Lee cleared his throat loudly. "Dr. Kim, we're in the middle of important negotiations," but Thexara was already reaching for the cup, with hands that shook like autumn leaves. The moment their fingers touched the warm ceramic, their scales shifted slightly, showing the first hint of their natural silver shine in hours. "Yes," the ambassador whispered. I think I would like that very much." As they walked toward the door together, Hana could feel the stares of everyone in the room burning into her back. She was breaking protocol, possibly endangering the entire mission, and definitely going to face serious consequences later, but right now none of that mattered. Right now she was just one being helping another, and sometimes that's exactly what the universe needed most. The observation lounge was quiet, with soft lighting and a view of the stars that stretched out like scattered diamonds on black velvet. Hana had chosen this spot carefully, knowing that Thexara needed somewhere peaceful, away from the harsh fluorescent lights and constant chatter of the diplomatic chambers. "Your captain is not pleased with you," Thexara observed, settling onto a specially designed chair that could accommodate their tall frame. Their scales were still flickering erratically, but the violent crackling had stopped. Hana poured herself some tea and sat across from the ambassador. "Captain Lee will get over it. He's more bark than bite." She took a sip and studied Thexara's face. "Besides, some things are more important than following rules." This was their third meeting in 2 days, and each time, Hana felt like she was piecing together a puzzle made of alien emotions and human intuition. The first session had been awkward, with lots of long silences and confused explanations. But something was working. Thexara's condition hadn't gotten worse, which was more progress than anyone had expected. "Tell me about the breathing technique, again," Thexara requested, their voice carrying notes of genuine curiosity mixed with desperate hope. Hana set down her cup and demonstrated, taking slow, deliberate breaths. "We call it the 4-7-8 method. Breathe in for 4 counts, hold for 7, then exhale for 8. It tricks your nervous system into calming down." "Nervous system," Thexara repeated thoughtfully. "We have something similar, but it operates through our scale networks rather than your lungs?" "Exactly. Your scales are like our nervous system, but external. They respond to your emotions and thoughts." Hana had spent hours researching Velthari physiology after their first meeting. When you're stressed, they become chaotic. When you're calm, they create beautiful patterns. Thexara attempted the breathing exercise, their chest rising and falling in the unfamiliar rhythm. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, a few scales near their shoulders began to pulse in sync with their breathing. The harsh flickers softened into gentle waves of silver light. "Remarkable," Thexara whispered, staring down at their own arm in amazement. "In all my cycles of existence, I have never seen such a simple method produce such results." Hana smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the tea. "Sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective. Humans have been dealing with stress and anxiety for thousands of years. We've gotten pretty good at finding ways to cope. Your species is considered primitive by many in the galactic community," Thexara said, then quickly added, "I do not mean offense. None taken. We're definitely not the most advanced species out there." Hana leaned back in her chair. "We can't read minds like you can. We don't have scales that reflect our emotions, and our technology is probably centuries behind yours. But we've learned how to take care of each other, especially when things get tough." Thexara's scales began to shift into more organized patterns, creating spirals and geometric shapes that were actually quite beautiful. "This caring for others, it is natural for humans. For most of us, we're social creatures. We've survived as a species because we help each other." Hana watched the patterns on Thexara's skin with fascination. "What does it feel like when your scales do that?" Like music becoming visible," Thexara explained, holding up their hand to watch the silver waves flow across their palm. "When I am calm, the patterns harmonize. When I am distressed, they create discord." "So you're basically wearing your emotions on the outside. That must be exhausting sometimes." "Very much so, especially when dealing with species who cannot understand our expressions." Thexara's voice carried a note of sadness. "Your people look at us and see only strange aliens. They do not realize that every flicker, every color change is communication." Hana felt a pang of guilt. How many times had she and her colleagues dismissed alien behavior as just weird without trying to understand what it meant? "We're learning, though. That's why I'm here. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars drift past the viewport. Thexara practiced the breathing exercises, and with each repetition, their scales became more stable. The improvement was visible and measurable, but more importantly, the ambassador seemed lighter somehow, like a weight was lifting from their shoulders. "Dr. Kim," Thexara said eventually, "may I ask why you chose to help me?" "Your superiors clearly disapprove," Hana considered the question. "Because you needed help and I could provide it. It's really that simple." She finished her tea and set the cup aside. "Where I come from, we have a saying. A problem shared is a problem halved. You were carrying something heavy alone, and that's not fair to anyone. Even an alien stranger, especially an alien stranger. If we can't show kindness to people who are different from us, how can we expect to build any kind of peaceful future together?" Thexara's scales shimmered with what Hana was beginning to recognize as contentment. "Your species may not be advanced in technology, Dr. Kim, but in wisdom, you may surpass us all." Outside the lounge, Hana could hear footsteps in the corridor. Their time was almost up, and soon they'd have to return to the formal world of protocols and negotiations. But here, in this quiet space between the stars, two very different beings had found common ground in the simple act of caring for one another. The sessions had become a daily routine now, much to Captain Lee's growing frustration. Every afternoon at 1400 hours, Hana would meet Thexara in the observation lounge, and every evening the ambassador would return to negotiations looking slightly more stable than before. It was progress, but it was slow progress, and patience was running thin on both sides. "You're walking a dangerous line, Dr. Kim," Security Chief Nam Hyan warned her as she prepared for another meeting. "The captain is getting pressure from Earth Command about these unauthorized therapy sessions." Hana adjusted the small bag she carried, filled with herbal teas, stress balls, and other simple human relaxation tools. "The ambassador's condition is improving. Isn't that what matters? What matters is completing this trade agreement before the Velthari decide we're not worth their time," Nam replied sharply. "And your little friendship sessions are making some people nervous." But Hana had stopped caring about what made other people nervous. What mattered was the way Thexara's scales had begun holding their patterns for longer periods, or how their voice had regained some of its musical quality. What mattered was the trust building between two beings who shouldn't have had anything in common. When she entered the lounge, Thexara was already there, standing by the viewport with their hands pressed against the transparent aluminum. Their scales were doing something new today, creating slow hypnotic spirals that reminded Hana of water swirling down a drain. "Rough morning?" she asked, setting down her bag and beginning their usual tea ritual. "The negotiations are not progressing." "Well," Thexara admitted without turning around, "your people drive hard bargains and my people grow impatient with the delays." Hana poured 2 cups of lavender tea, something she'd discovered helped stabilize Thexara's scale patterns even better than chamomile. "Want to talk about it?" Thexara finally turned, and Hana was surprised to see that their scales weren't just stressed. They were showing patterns she'd never seen before, deep dark swirls mixed with bright flashes, like storm clouds lit by lightning. "My world is dying, Dr. Kim," Thexara said quietly, accepting the tea with hands that barely trembled anymore. "Not slowly, not over generations. Within 50 of your years, our sun will expand and consume our planet. Every Velthari alive will die unless we find new homes." The words hit Hana like a physical blow. She'd known the negotiations were important, but she hadn't realized they were literally about survival. "The trade agreement is our last hope. We have approached 17 different species over the past decade. Some have refused outright. Others have offered terms so unfavorable that acceptance would mean slavery rather than salvation." Thexara's scales darkened further. "Humans are our final option." Hana set down her cup with shaking hands. "That's an incredible amount of pressure to carry alone. I was chosen because I am considered the strongest of my people, the most capable of handling stress and making difficult decisions." Thexara's laugh was bitter, creating discordant notes that made Hana wince. "But strength without balance becomes brittleness, as you humans might say." "No wonder you're having breakdowns. You're trying to save your entire species." Hana moved to sit beside Thexara on the specially modified couch. Have you told anyone else how you're feeling? Velthari do not discuss emotional weakness, especially not leaders. To show vulnerability would be to show unfitness for the responsibility. The ambassador's scales began the familiar chaotic flickering. Until I met you, I had no outlet for these feelings. Hana watched the patterns on Thexara's skin with new understanding. Every flicker wasn't just stress, it was fear. Fear for billions of lives depending on one person's ability to negotiate successfully. Let's try something different today. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, smooth stone. This is called a worry stone. Humans have used them for centuries when we need to focus our anxiety into something physical. Thexara examined the stone curiously. You simply hold it. You rub it with your thumb while you talk about what's bothering you. The repetitive motion helps calm your mind, and speaking your worries out loud makes them feel less overwhelming. Hana demonstrated, running her thumb over the worn surface. Try it. As Thexara began working the stone, something unexpected happened. Their scales started responding to the rhythm, creating gentle waves that pulsed in time with their thumb movements. This is soothing, they admitted, surprise clear in their voice. Now tell me about your world, Hana said gently. Not the dying sun or the negotiations. Tell me about the good parts. What will you miss most? For the next hour, Thexara spoke of crystalline cities that sang in the wind, of vast libraries where knowledge was stored in living memory crystals, of gardens where plants grew in perfect mathematical spirals. Their scales shifted from storm patterns to gentle, nostalgic hues as they described their home. The singing gardens were my favorite place as a youngling, Thexara said, their voice soft with memory. The plants would harmonize with our emotional frequencies, creating music that changed based on how we felt. It sounds beautiful. We'll make sure your people get to create new singing gardens, Hana said firmly. Earth has plenty of space, and humans are good at sharing when it matters. You speak with such confidence, but your negotiators seem less generous than you. Hana smiled, feeling pieces of a plan clicking together in her mind. That's because they don't understand what they're really negotiating for. They think this is about trade and technology. They don't realize they're holding the future of an entire civilization in their hands. Thexara's scales brightened considerably. You think you can help them understand? I think it's time we had a real conversation about what you need and what we can offer. No more formal diplomatic language, no more playing games with numbers and percentages. Hana stood up, suddenly energized. Sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to be completely honest about it. For the first time since she'd met them, Thexara's scales showed patterns that looked like hope. The morning of the final negotiations started like any other, but Hana could feel tension crackling through the ship's corridors like electricity before a storm. She'd barely slept, knowing that today would determine the fate of billions of Velthari lives. The weight of that responsibility sat heavy on her shoulders, and she couldn't imagine how Thexara was handling it. When she arrived at the diplomatic chamber, she immediately noticed something was wrong. Thexara stood at their designated position, but their scales were completely colorless, like looking at a black and white photograph. The ambassador's hands were clenched so tightly that their knuckles had turned an alarming shade of blue. Ambassador looks rough today, Lieutenant Park whispered, but Hana was already moving toward her scanner, her heart pounding with worry. The readings were worse than anything she'd seen before. Thexara's biosignatures were spiking in dangerous patterns, and their telepathic output was fluctuating wildly. This wasn't just stress anymore. This was a complete system breakdown waiting to happen. Captain Lee called the meeting to order, his voice crisp and businesslike. Today we'll be finalizing the terms of our agreement. The Earth Council has reviewed your proposals and prepared our counteroffer. Hana watched in growing horror as Thexara's scales began to flicker rapidly, like a television with bad reception. The ambassador was trying to maintain composure, but their control was slipping with each passing moment. The Earth Council is prepared to offer relocation assistance for up to 10 million Velthari citizens, Captain Lee announced, reading from his tablet. This represents a generous compromise from our initial position of 5 million. The words, hit the chamber like a bomb. 10 million, out of nearly 3 billion Velthari who needed homes. Thexara's scales went completely white, then began cycling through colors so rapidly they became a blur. 10 million, they repeated, their voice cracking like breaking glass. You would condemn 2,990,000,000 of my people to death. We have to be realistic about Earth's capacity, Captain Lee replied, his tone remaining professional despite the devastating nature of his words. 10 million represents a significant commitment of resources. Significant commitment, Thexara whispered, and Hana could see cracks beginning to appear in their composure. Literal cracks, thin lines of light appearing along their arms where their scales were separating. Ambassador, Hana called out, ignoring protocol completely. Perhaps we should take a break. But it was too late. The dam had broken. Thexara's carefully maintained control shattered like glass. Their scales exploded into chaotic patterns of light and color, so bright that several humans had to shield their eyes. A sound like screaming metal filled the chamber, and Hana realized it was coming from the ambassador themselves. "My children," Thexara cried out, their voice no longer musical but raw and broken. "My parents, my siblings, my entire civilization, and you offer to save less than 1%. The telepathic scream that followed hit everyone in the room like a physical blow. Lieutenant Park collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. Captain Lee stumbled backward, his face pale with shock. Around the chamber, humans were dropping like flies as Thexara's mental anguish broadcast at full intensity. But the worst part was what was happening to Thexara themselves. The cracks in their scales were spreading, and energy was beginning to arc between the gaps. Hana had read about this in her research, but seeing it in person was terrifying. When a Velthari had a complete breakdown, their body's energy regulation systems could fail catastrophically. "Security to the diplomatic chamber now," Captain Lee shouted into his communicator, but his voice was lost in the chaos of Thexara's continued mental broadcast. Hana didn't think. She didn't calculate risks or consider protocols. She just moved. Running across the chamber, she dodged the dangerous energy arcs crackling around Thexara's form. The heat was intense, like standing too close to a bonfire, and the telepathic screaming was getting louder, more desperate. "Thexara!" she shouted, reaching out to grab the ambassador's shoulders. The moment her hands made contact, electricity shot through her arms, making her muscles spasm. But she held on. "Listen to my voice," she said firmly, fighting through the pain and the psychic noise. "Remember our breathing exercises. 4 counts in, 7 counts hold, 8 counts out." For a moment, nothing happened. The energy continued to build, and Hana could smell ozone and burning metal. Several people were trying to pull her away, but she refused to let go. "Focus on my voice," she repeated, louder this time. "Find your center, like we practiced. You are not alone in this." Slowly, impossibly, she felt Thexara's breathing begin to match hers. The chaotic light patterns on their scales started to slow, and the telepathic screaming reduced to a whisper. "That's it," Hana encouraged, even as her own hands were being burned by the residual energy. "Just breathe with me. We'll figure this out together." The crackling energy began to fade. The cracks in Thexara's scales sealed themselves. The dangerous arcing stopped, and the telepathic storm quieted to gentle waves. In the sudden silence that followed, every person in the chamber was staring at them in complete shock. Hana was still holding on to Thexara, both of them breathing heavily, both of them alive. "Impossible," Captain Lee whispered. "No human has ever survived direct contact with a Velthari energy discharge." But Hana wasn't thinking about survival or impossibility. She was thinking about the tear tracks on Thexara's face and the way their scales had settled into patterns of deep sadness mixed with profound gratitude. "Thank you," Thexara whispered, their voice barely audible. "You saved my life." "You saved all our lives," Hana replied, finally letting go and immediately missing the connection. "Now, let's see about saving your people." 3 months had passed since the crisis in the diplomatic chamber, and Hana still couldn't believe how much had changed. She stood on the bridge of the New Harmony, the first ship ever designed and built jointly by humans and Velthari. Watching as both species worked side by side at control stations, that had been specifically designed to accommodate their different needs. The negotiations had taken a dramatic turn after Thexara's breakdown. Captain Lee, shaken by what he'd witnessed, had immediately contacted Earth Command to request an emergency session. Within hours, the full video of Hana's intervention was being broadcast to every major leader on Earth. The sight of a human woman risking her life to save an alien ambassador had touched something deep in humanity's collective heart. Dr. Kim, Thexara approached, their scales now displaying the steady, beautiful patterns that Hana had come to associate with contentment and health. The Velthari Council's message has arrived. Would you like to read it together? Hana smiled, still amazed at how natural their friendship had become. Of course, though I have to admit I'm still processing everything that's happened. They moved to Hana's quarters, a space that had been specially modified to accommodate both human and Velthari comfort preferences. The lighting could shift between harsh human fluorescence and the softer, color-changing illumination that Velthari preferred. The furniture could be adjusted for different body types, and the air filtration system maintained the perfect mixture of gases for both species. The Council has reached a unanimous decision, Thexara said, activating a communication device that projected holographic text in both human and Velthari languages. They want to offer you something that has never been offered to any non-Velthari in our history. Hana read the message twice before the words fully sank in. They want to share your cognitive enhancement technology with me and establish an interspecies psychological research center. More than that, Thexara's scales shimmered with excitement. They want you to become the first human to receive full Velthari mental augmentation. Your brain would be enhanced to process information at near Velthari levels, and you would gain limited telepathic abilities. The offer was staggering. Humans had been trying to understand Velthari technology for decades, and now they were offering to share their most advanced capabilities with a single person. But Hana found herself thinking about the bigger picture. What about your people's relocation? That's way more important than any technology transfer. Thexara's expression became serious. That has been resolved. After your intervention became public knowledge on Earth, something unprecedented happened. Humans from every nation began volunteering to help with the relocation effort. Your leaders received over 50 million applications from people wanting to assist with integration programs. Hana felt tears welling up in her eyes. 50 million? Your species responded to our crisis with overwhelming generosity once they understood what was at stake. Earth has agreed to accept all 3 billion Velthari refugees, not just 10 million. New cities are being planned, joint colonies are being established on Mars and Europa, and integration programs are being developed worldwide. The magnitude of it was almost impossible to comprehend. Humanity had essentially agreed to increase Earth's population by nearly 50% to save an alien species. It was the largest humanitarian effort in history, and it had all started with a simple cup of tea and a willingness to listen. There's more, Thexara continued, their scales now cycling through colors that Hana recognized as deep emotion. Your stress relief techniques have been adapted for Velthari physiology and are now being taught throughout our society. Mental health resources that never existed before are being established. You've given my people tools to handle emotional crises that we never developed on our own. Lieutenant Park appeared in the doorway, looking slightly embarrassed. Sorry to interrupt, but Captain Lee wants to see you both on the bridge. Apparently there's another alien delegation requesting to meet with Dr. Kim specifically. As they walked through the corridors of the New Harmony, Hana marveled at how natural the mixed crews had become. Humans and Velthari shared jokes, worked on complex problems together, and had developed a hybrid communication style that combined verbal language with scale pattern reading. On the bridge, Captain Lee was grinning from ear to ear. Dr. Kim, meet Ambassador Zixanth from the Crystalline Collective. They've heard about your work with Thexara and want to discuss some mental health challenges their species is facing. The new ambassador was unlike anything Hana had ever seen, with a body that seemed to be made of living gemstones that refracted light in impossible ways. But their posture and the way they held themselves reminded her of Thexara during those first difficult days. "Dr. Kim," Zixanth said, their voice like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, "my people have struggled with collective anxiety disorders for generations. We have heard that humans possess unique abilities to provide emotional support across species, barriers. Would you be willing to help us?" Hannah looked around the bridge at the faces watching her. Human faces filled with pride and hope, Velthari faces displaying patterns of encouragement and friendship, and now this new species reaching out for help. 6 months ago, she'd been just another xenopsychologist doing routine work on a research. "So Vessel, I'd be honored to help," she said, and meant it completely. Later that evening, as she sat in the observation lounge where everything had started, Hannah reflected on the journey that had brought them all here. It hadn't been advanced technology, or military might, that had created this new era of interspecies cooperation. It had been something much simpler and much more powerful, the willingness of one person to see suffering and respond with kindness. Thexara joined her at the viewport, their scales displaying the gentle patterns she'd come to love. "What are you thinking about?" "How sometimes the smallest actions can change everything," Hannah replied, watching the stars stream past. A cup of tea, a quiet conversation, a willingness to help someone who's different from you. "Your species has a gift," Thexara said quietly, "not for technology or warfare, but for seeing others as worthy of care and compassion. That may be the most valuable trait in the galaxy." As the new harmony continued its journey toward new worlds and new possibilities, Hannah smiled at the thought that humanity's greatest export to the universe wouldn't be weapons or machines, but something far more precious, the simple, revolutionary idea that everyone deserves kindness, no matter how different they might seem.